The dawn came gray over the Absaroka Range, and the snow fell in slow, patient sheets that did not seem to belong to any hour of any day. It fell on the cedar shakes of the cabin roof. It fell on the split rail fence around the lower paddock. It fell on the body of the brood mare lying on her side outside the north stable. Her great chestnut neck stretched long across the white ground, a small, dark crater above her shoulder where the rifle ball had taken her. Verity Sutcliffe knelt beside the mare with both hands pressed against the wound, though she had known for 2 minutes already that there was nothing left to press. The blood had stopped pulsing. The flank had stopped rising. The mare's open eye reflected the gray sky and held it without blinking, the way a still pool of water holds the sky after the wind has gone down. Verity was 22 years old. She had been a married woman for 94 days. She had once worn lace gloves to choir practice in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Her hands now were red to the wrists. A shadow moved at the edge of her vision. Rufus Hawthorne came around the corner of the stable in his oilskin coat, with the long buffalo collar turned up against the wind. He did not run. He did not call out. Rufus Hawthorne had not run for any reason since he was 17 years old, and he did not run now. He simply walked across the snow with that long, even stride of his and stopped 6 feet from his wife, and he looked down at the dead mare and then at the distant tree line where 4 sets of hoof prints disappeared into the blue dark of the pines. "Sovereign eye," he said. It was not a question. Verity shook her head. She could not yet manage a word. The black stallion was gone. The pride of the Hawthorne line. $6,000 on the hoof. 7 years of breeding. The horse her father-in-law had spent the last good years of his life building brick by patient brick before a man named Quincy Bramwell pushed him off a cliff for refusing to sell. A second figure emerged from the pines on the north slope, leading his roan gelding by the bridle, a Spencer rifle laid across his shoulders like a yoke. Wendell Hawthorne moved with that careful, half-watchful step that Verity had come to know, in the long months since her arrival, the step of a man who had once walked into a valley with 268 other men and walked out with 37. He stopped beside his brother. He looked at the mare. He looked at the tracks. 4 riders, he said, heading for Devil's Tooth Pass. 2 hours lead, no more. Rufus drew his pistol from the holster at his hip and broke it open, and his eyes counted the brass rims of the cartridges by long habit, though he had loaded the cylinder himself an hour before sunrise. He snapped it closed. "You stay," he said to Verity. She rose from the snow. The blood on her hands was already beginning to freeze into dark patches. She went to the post where her own Winchester leaned, and she took it down, and she worked the lever once to seat a fresh round. "I am going with you," she said. Rufus looked at her then, and something passed across his face that he did not let stay there long. It was not surprise. It was not refusal. It was the look of a man who had spent 40 days teaching his wife to ride and shoot and read tracks in the snow, and who understood now, on this gray morning, that she had learned everything he had taught her, and that he no longer had the right to say no. "Saddle Mercy," he said. The 3 of them rode out of the yard at a hard trot 10 minutes later. The snow fell harder. The pines closed behind them. A single black crow lifted from a high branch and called once, and then there was no sound but the muffled thunder of 3 sets of hooves beating north into the country. No man rode willingly in winter. But to understand how a preacher's daughter from Lancaster came to be hunting horse thieves in the Absarokas with 2 men she called husband and brother, we have to go back through the 94 days of her marriage, back through the biennial slow weeks when she learned what her hands were for, back to the first afternoon when she stepped down from a Concord stagecoach into a silence so deep it rang in her ears like the inside of a cathedral bell. The driver of that Concord was a sun-creased old man named Ezekiel Crow, and he had been carrying mail and passengers across the Wyoming Territory for 19 years. And in all those 19 years, he had never been so glad to be rid of a passenger as he was this one. He had carried her 13 days from the railhead at Cheyenne. She had eaten almost nothing. She had spoken almost less. She had pressed a folded letter against the bodice of her navy traveling dress every time the coach went over a rough patch, the way a soldier presses a hand against a wound that has not yet learned how to bleed. The coach rolled to a stop at a leaning wooden signpost beside the trail, and the old man peered through the snow and read the words on the sign, though he knew them by heart. Meade's Crossing, 4 miles. Beyond the signpost, a trail bent away into a wall of dark pines, and beyond the pines, there was no town, no station, no friendly lamp burning in any window. "Miss," he said through the small front window, "this is where I leave you." Verity Sutcliffe pressed her gloved hands flat against the worn leather of the seat. She looked out through the small window, and she saw the signpost, and she saw the snow, and she saw nothing else at all. The letter said a Mr. Hawthorne would be meeting me at the station. "This is the station, miss." "But there is no station." "No, miss, there is not." The old man would not look at her. That was the thing she remembered afterward, more than the cold, more than the snow. The old man would not look at her. He looked instead at the dark line of the trees, and his hand kept moving on the reins in small, restless circles, the way a man's hand moves when he wants very much to be somewhere else. "The hawthorns come down from the mountain when they please," he said at last. "If they do not come, miss, you will want to start walking before dark. There are wolves in the country and worse." He would not say what worse. She understood, looking at his face, that she would not have wanted him to. Her trunk landed in the frozen earth with the dull thud of a door closing on the life she had left behind. The Concord lurched forward. The wheels groaned in the new snow. Within 2 minutes, the coach was a small, dark shape dwindling toward the eastern horizon, and then it was nothing at all, and Verity Sutcliffe stood alone on the trail with 73 cents in her purse and a letter against her breast, and the first true snow of a Wyoming winter coming down around her shoulders in slow, patient silence. She was 22 years old. She had been alone in the world for 9 months and 12 days. She stood very still. She did not cry. She had finished her crying 9 weeks ago in a boarding house on Boston Avenue in Lancaster, the night the proprietor had laid his hand on the small of her back and explained in the manner of a kind uncle giving advice the various ways a young woman with no money might pay her room and board. She thought of her father, then the way she had thought of him every hour of every day since the lung sickness took him in March. The Reverend Reuben Sutcliffe, who had served the Methodist faithful of 3 small farming parishes for 24 years, who had also kept 4 good Morgan mares behind his rectory and had bred them carefully and had loved them only a little less than he loved God, who had taught his youngest daughter when she was 14 years old how to reach inside a laboring mare with the small, clean hands the Lord had given her and turn a foal that had presented wrong. "The Lord gave you thus hands for a reason, Verity," he had said that night in the lamplit barn. "A steady hand serves man and beast alike." She remembered his voice now standing in the snow. She remembered the smell of clean straw and warm flank. She remembered the foal sliding out into her father's waiting hands, alive, dark, perfect. She heard them before she saw them. It was a sound she did not at first recognize, a low, rhythmic drumming that seemed to come up out of the frozen earth itself. She turned toward the tree line, and the sound resolved into what it truly was. Hooves. 2 sets of hooves descending the mountain in unhurried tandem. 2 riders came out of the pines. Not 3 as she had somehow imagined. 2. They rode abreast down a narrow trail no eastern eye would have called a trail at all. Their wide hats were pulled low against the snow. Their long canvas coats were buttoned to the throat. The breath of their horses rose in a single white cloud that moved with them as they came. Verity tried to move. She found that she could not. They stopped their horses 10 paces from her. They did not speak. For the longest moment of her young life, Verity Sutcliffe and the 2 Hawthorne brothers regarded one another across the falling snow, and she had time enough to see that they were brothers, yes, but not as alike as the letter had led her to imagine. The taller one sat his horse with a stillness that came from someplace deep inside him, a stillness that had been learned and not given. His beard was a dark brown threaded already with gray, though he could not have been more than 33 or 4. His eyes beneath the brim of the hat were the color of weathered steel. The small finger of his right hand resting on the horn of his saddle ended at the second knuckle. Frostbite, she would later learn, a hard winter when he was 19. The shorter brother sat his horse differently. He sat it the way a man sits a horse who has learned not to let any part of himself be still for too long. His eyes did not stop moving. They went across the tree line, across the snow, across her and past her and back again. There was a Spencer rifle laid across his thighs and a Bowie knife at his hip, and his right hand never stopped resting near the rifle stock, not because he was afraid, but because his hand had forgotten how to rest anywhere else. There was a softness at the corner of his mouth that the older brother did not have. But there was also something behind his eyes that the older brother did not have. A long sorrow that had taken up residence and would not leave. The taller one swung down from the saddle in a single easy motion, and Verity was startled to see that he stood a full head and a half above her. He took 2 paces forward and stopped. "Miss Sutcliffe," he said. His voice was lower than she had imagined, rougher, the voice of a man who did not often use it for the purpose of conversation. "Yes," it was all she could manage. "I am Rufus Hawthorne. This is my brother Wendell." The shorter man touched the brim of his hat once. He did not dismount. He did not speak. "There is something I must say to you," Rufus said, "before you come any farther up that mountain with us. And when I have said it, miss, you may want to turn around. If you do, I will see you back to Meade's Crossing tonight. I will pay your passage on the eastbound train tomorrow morning. I will put $500 in your hand when you board it. That is the word of a Hawthorne, and a Hawthorne's word does not bend." She felt the cold reach down inside her coat and lay its hand against her ribs. "Tell me," she said. "My letter said a man on this mountain needed a wife. That is the truth, but it is not the whole truth." He drew a breath, and she swam for the first time and with a small, startled clarity that this man, like a wall of weathered timber, was afraid. Not of her, of losing something he had not yet been given. "Wendell and I have lived in the same house since the day we were born," he said. "Our mother died when I was 11 and he was 7. Our father died 4 years ago. Wendell came back from the territories of the Sioux in 1876, and he has not been altogether well in his sleep since. He sleeps in the loft of the barn, miss, because the cabin has too many walls for him, and the cabin has nights in it he cannot bear. He will not leave the barn loft. He cannot leave it, and I will not ask him to." He paused, his breath fogging in the cold. "I am the one who will marry you. My name will be on the papers. My ring will be on your hand. You will have the upstairs bedroom of our cabin. There is a lock on the door, and the key is yours from the moment you walk through it, and no one in this family will cross that threshold for any reason, as long as you live, unless you open the door yourself and do it willingly." She found that she had stopped breathing some time ago. "6 months," he said, "that is the term. At the end of 6 months, you may go, and the $500 in your passage east will be yours, and no Hawthorne will ever speak your name with anything but gratitude. Or you may stay. Whatever you choose, it will be yours to choose." He waited. She looked past him at the brother on the horse. Wendell Hawthorne met her gaze for one long second. He did not smile, but neither did he look away. There was something in his eyes she would only later learn to name. It was the look of a drowning man who has caught a glimpse of the shore, but does not yet know whether the shore is real. She thought of the boarding house in Lancaster. She thought of her brother-in-law, Lemuel Pickett, who had taken $1,800 of her father's small estate and vanished into the smoke of the Western trains. She thought of the 73 cents in her purse and the snow on her shoulders and the way the old stage driver had not been able to look her in the eye. "I will come with you," she said. Rufus Hawthorne closed his eyes for one full second. When he opened them again, she saw that something inside him had broken and been remade in the space of a single breath. "Thank you," he said. He unbuckled his canvas coat without another word and laid it across her shoulders. The coat was so large it hung to her ankles. It smelled of pine smoke and saddle leather and of a man who worked with his hands from sunup until dark. Wendell dismounted then only to lift her trunk onto the back of the pack horse he had been leading. He glanced at her once as he tied it down. The glance carried something she could not read. Apology, perhaps, or sorrow, or some third thing she did not yet have a name for. They rode up the mountain as the last of the light bled from the sky. The trail switched back and forth across the face of the Absaroka. The pines closed over them. The snow came down through the high branches in slow drifting flakes that caught the last of the afternoon and glowed for a moment before they landed. She had never seen a forest like this. The woods of Pennsylvania were tame. They had fences at their edges. These woods had no edges. These woods were the world. Wendell rode behind her now 100 paces back. Every so often she heard him stop his horse, and she understood without turning that he was looking at the trail behind them. He did this perhaps 8 times before she lost count. She did not ask Rufus what his brother was watching for. She did not yet want to know. Cold Hollow opened before them just as full dark came on. The cabin sat in a small clearing on a shoulder of the mountain, 2 stories of squared pine fitted so tightly that no whisper of wind could pass between the logs. Real glass in the windows, a roof of split cedar, a great stone chimney from which a single column of smoke rose straight up into the windless dark, a barn larger than the house, a smokehouse, a spring house, a long wood shed stacked so high with split pine that she could not see where the stack ended. Someone had cared for this place. Someone had spent 22 years building it into what it was. She understood in that first long look that she had badly misjudged these men from the moment she had stepped down from the coach. Rufus dismounted at the barn and led the horses inside. Wendell followed without a word. Verity was helped down from her saddle and her boots touched the trampled snow of the yard, and her knees nearly buckled from cold and exhaustion and the strange weightlessness of having finally arrived somewhere. "The door is unlocked," Rufus called from the barn. "Go inside, warm yourself. We will see to the horses." She walked across the yard on legs that did not feel like hers. She put her hand on the iron latch of the cabin door. She pushed. What she walked into was not what she had expected. She had expected the rough den of 2 bachelors. She had expected dirt, a sour smell, the mean disorder of men who had forgotten how civilization looked. What she walked into was a home. The floors were swept pine. The hearth was swept too, and in it a fire roared behind a screen of woven iron. A long plank table ran the length of the main room, set already with 3 places. 3 plates, 3 tin cups, 3 iron forks. Beyond the table, a kitchen with a cast iron stove and rows of shelves filled with tin goods and jars of preserved fruit, each jar labeled in pencil in a careful hand. Beyond the kitchen, a door that must lead to Rufus's room. Along the far wall, a bookcase floor to ceiling, more books than she had seen outside a library in Pennsylvania. And on the wall above the hearth hung carefully on 2 iron pegs a long cavalry saber with a scarred wooden grip, the saber of Captain Cyrus Hawthorne, late of the Union Army of the Potomac. She did not know that yet, but she knew at once that the weapon had not been hung there for show. It had been hung there for memory. There was a small framed daguerreotype on a side table, a dark-haired woman with a firm, sweet mouth and the eyes the brothers had. The mother who had died when the boys were 7 and 11. Beulah Hawthorne. Verity would learn the name later. She did not need it yet. She stood in the middle of the warm, clean room, and without warning, she began to cry. She did not cry loudly. She had never been a woman who cried loudly. She cried the way she had been crying for 9 months since the first cough had shaken her father's frame in the small parsonage in Lancaster. Quietly, with her shoulders still, with one gloved hand pressed against her mouth. The door opened behind her. She did not hear him cross the room. She only felt the presence of a man 2 paces back waiting, and she knew without turning that it was Rufus. He did not speak. He waited. When she had breathed enough, she said without turning around, "I do not know why I am crying." "You are crying because you are home," Rufus said quietly, "and you did not know you were." He left her then. She heard the door close. She heard him cross the yard back to the barn. She stood alone in the firelight and let herself fall apart for 1 full minute. And then she straightened her shoulders the way her mother had taught her, and she wiped her face with the back of her hand, and she went looking for warm water and a clean cloth, because the dress beneath the borrowed coat had 13 days of railcar dust on it, and a preacher's daughter did not sit at a stranger's table in a soiled dress, no matter how exhausted she was. That first supper, she ate 2 helpings of elk stew and a quarter loaf of sourdough bread that Wendell had baked that morning. The brothers watched her eat with the careful attention of men who had not seen a woman take food at their table in 8 years. They did not try to make conversation. Neither did she. The silence in that cabin was not an absence. It was a presence. It held the room the way a held breath holds a chest. Afterward, Rufus walked her to the foot of the staircase and handed her a small kerosene lamp and a heavy iron key on a leather thong. "The room at the top of the stairs," he said. "The key is yours. No one else has a copy. Lock it tonight. Lock it every night for as long as you live in this house. I will sleep better knowing you have." She climbed the stairs. The room was a better room than she had slept in for over a year. A 4-post bed with a down-tick mattress. A red and white quilt stitched long ago by a hand she would never meet. A small iron stove already lit and warming the air. A washstand. A rag rug. A single window looking out over the dark mountain. And on the sill in a small glass vase, a single sprig of dried lavender. Wendell, she would later understand, had put it there that morning. He could not remember the last time he had spoken to a woman in his own kitchen, but he remembered somehow that women liked lavender. She turned the iron key into the lock. She lay down in her clothes because she was not yet ready to undress in a strange house, and she pulled the red and white quilt to her chin, and below her she heard the low murmur of 2 men's voices, the sound of brothers talking at the end of a day, the way they had talked at the end of every day of their lives. She heard one of them laugh once, a short surprise laugh. She thought it might have been Wendell Law. It was the laugh of a man who had not expected to laugh that day. Outside the window, the stars came out over the Absaroka. The wind fell off. A great silence settled on the homestead, the silence of a world in which nothing was happening except 2 men and 1 woman beginning slowly and carefully to learn how to share a roof. The first 6 weeks taught her what her hands were for. She had thought she knew. She had grown up keeping a parsonage. She had baked the bread for her father's table and mended his black coat and trimmed the wicks of 40 oil lamps for the parish. She had thought a woman's hands were for tending and for gentling. In Cold Hollow, she learned that a woman's hands were also for splitting kindling at 4 in the morning when the stove had gone cold, for pulling a half-frozen calf out of a drift before the cold killed it, for loading a Winchester in the dark and feeling the brass of each cartridge with her fingertips so she would know without looking that the magazine was full, for reading the prints of 4 shod horses in fresh snow and knowing from the depth of the impression which of those horses was carrying a heavier rider. Wendell taught her the rifle. He took her out behind the barn on the second morning of her second week, and he set up 6 tin cans on a long pine rail at 50 paces, and he handed her the Winchester and said almost shyly, "My brother said you could shoot. I would like to see it." She hit 2 of the cans on her first 6 shots. She hit 4 of the next 6. By the end of the 3rd week, she was hitting all 6 every time, and Wendell was setting the cans at 70 paces, and then at 90, and then he was hanging a small pumpkin from a length of rope and swinging it on the wind, and she was knocking the pumpkin off the rope on the 3rd or 4th shot. "Your father taught you the basics," he said one cold morning, watching her load. "Who taught you to breathe out before the squeeze?" "He did. He said the Lord made the lungs and the trigger to work together if a body would let them." Wendell almost smiled. Your father was an unusual man for a Methodist preacher. My father was an unusual man for a man, she said. Wendell looked at her for a moment that lasted a beat too long. Then he turned away and reset the cans. Rufus taught her the horse. He taught her to ride a working stock saddle, not the lady's side saddle of her childhood. He taught her to mount from either side. He taught her how to keep her seat when a horse cut hard left at a gallop. He taught her how to draw a pistol from a hip holster while the horse was moving, which she could not yet do well, but which she could no longer do badly. It was on the 11th morning of these lessons that he stood behind her at the firing rail to correct the angle of her right shoulder against the stock of the Winchester. He was a careful man. He did not touch her. He spoke to her over her shoulder, and his right arm came around to indicate without contact the small adjustment her elbow needed to make. But his breath was at her ear. She felt the warmth of it on her cold cheek. He was so close behind her that the wool of his coat brushed the wool of hers. He stayed there for the space of perhaps 4 seconds. Then he stepped back. He stepped back hard. He cleared his throat once and he said, "That will do for today, miss." And he walked away across the yard toward the barn without looking back. Verity stood at the rail with the rifle still raised. Her hands had begun to tremble. She lowered the rifle slowly and she set it down on the rail, and she discovered that she could not for the life of her remember what she had been about to fire at. That was the 11th day. On the 17th day, the circuit preacher came up the mountain. The Reverend Ambrose Halliday was a tall, lean man with a windburned face who had been riding the Wyoming circuit for 20 years and who carried the small weight of 1,000 frontier marriages in his saddlebag. The ceremony took place before the hearth in the main room. Wendell stood as witness. There were no flowers. There was no music. Rufus had no ring of his own, but when the moment came for the ring, he reached into the pocket of his father's old black frock coat and drew out a thin gold band, much polished, and he slid it onto her finger. "This was my mother's," he said quietly so only she could hear. "She left it for the wife of whichever of us married first. I did not give it to Sarah. I wanted Sarah to have a ring that was only hers, but I would like for you to have this one, if you will allow me." She closed her hand around the ring and could not for a moment speak. "I will allow you," she managed. There was no kiss. He inclined his head to her in that small, courtly half-bow she had first seen from him at the breakfast table, and she returned the gesture, and the Reverend Halliday pronounced them husband and wife, and Wendell took the fiddle down from its peg and played a single slow Irish air that had been their mother's favorite. That night, lying in the upstairs room with her new ring on her finger, Verity heard her husband downstairs banking the fire, and she heard her brother-in-law walking the perimeter of the yard one last time, and she understood for the first time fully that the men below her were not lonely men who had ordered a wife the way another man might order a saw. They were men who had been fighting something for a long time. They had been losing, and they had asked her by the most courteous letter of which they were capable to come and stand at their fire because they needed a witness to whatever happened next. She did not yet know what they were fighting. She would learn within 24 hours. It was old Jeb Tannehill who brought the warning. He came riding up out of the pines at an hour past noon on the 18th day of her marriage on the small, tough mountain pony he had ridden for the better part of 15 years. Old Jeb was not as Verity had at first taken him to be an Indian. He was a Scotsman by blood born in Glasgow in 1819, who had come west as a boy of 21 and had lived among the Crow people for 12 full years and had learned from them the slow ways a man could move through this country and the small things a man could read in dust and water and the bend of a single broken twig. His Crow wife had died of pneumonia in the long winter of 1864. He had not married again. He lived in a one-room cabin 3 miles north of the Hawthorne place, and he had been Captain Cyrus Hawthorne's closest friend on this earth, and after Cyrus had been killed, he had become something like an uncle to the two grown sons. He swung down from his pony in the yard. He did not knock. He came through the cabin door with his hat in his hand and his eyes on Rufus, and he said in his slow bird voice, 4 men crossed the lower meadow at first light, heading north toward Devil's Tooth. One of them I know by his face. Boondoggle. He did not come this far up the country to pass through Lad. He came up to look. Rufus stood up from the table. The chair scraped on the pine floor. Bramwell. Aye. Verity set down the cup of coffee she had been holding. She looked from her husband to her brother-in-law to the old man in the doorway, and she saw the same small tightening pass across all three faces, and she understood with a clarity that arrived in her chest like a cold stone, dropping into a still pool, that she had walked into the middle of something that had been going on for years before her stagecoach ever crossed the Mississippi. Sit down, Verity, Rufus said. She sat. He sat across from her. He did not pour himself fresh coffee. He laid both his hands flat on the table. There is something I should have told you on the trail the first day, he said. I did not. I did not because I needed you to come up that mountain on the strength of your own free choice. And I thought that if I told you the whole of it down at the signpost, you would not come, and Wendell and I needed you to come more than I knew how to say. So I asked you to step into the middle of a story that was already running without telling you it was a story at all. I owe you the rest of it now. She listened. My father did not fall off a cliff 4 years ago, Rufus said. My father was murdered. A man named Quincy Bramwell killed him. Bramwell was a Confederate cavalry captain in the war. He rode with Mosby's Rangers in Virginia. After the surrender, he came west, and he found himself a new line of work. He is a horse thief, and he is a killer of men, and he is a buyer of land. He spotted Black Sovereign when the colt was 3 years old, and he came up this mountain himself and offered my father $2,000 for him, and my father said no. A month later, my father was found at the foot of the bluffs above Meade's Crossing with what the coroner called a fall. Wendell and I went and looked at his body before we buried him. There was a bruise across his right shoulder in the perfect shape of a horse's hoof. He had been ridden down. He had been pushed. Verity did not move. For 4 years, Rufus said, Bramwell has been tightening the country around us. 6 trail herds have been hit between here and the railhead in the last 18 months. Asa Mercer lost his stallion in October. The Brennan place was burned out of business in November, and the family went back to Iowa. Bramwell does not raid this country at random. He picks the small ranches one by one, and he takes their best stock, and he waits until the owner is desperate enough to sell out cheap. Then his man in Cheyenne, a paper company called the Continental Stock Association, buys the land for a song, and the next year that land is running Bramwell's brand. He has done it 3 times in Wyoming. He has done it twice in Montana. He is doing it to us, and we are the last large piece left in this corner of the country, and Black Sovereign is the prize that pays for the patience. He paused. He looked at her for a long, level moment. Wendell and I needed a wife in this house, he said, because a man with a wife and a fire and a Sabbath table is a different kind of man from 2 brothers alone in a cabin. He is harder to drive out. He is harder to hang for resisting. He has a witness. He has a name on a deed beside his own. We did not write to you in order to use you, Verity. We wrote to you in order to live. There is a difference, but the difference does not change the fact that I did not tell you, and I am telling you now. The fire crackled. Old Jeb stood by the door and did not move. Wendell sat at the far end of the table with both his hands wrapped around a tin cup he was not drinking from. There is more, Rufus said. Bramwell already knows about you. The news that the Hawthorne place has a wife was in Cheyenne within 4 days of your arrival. He will read that as a sign that we are settling in. He will read it as a sign that he must act now before we can put any more roots down. The 4 men old Jeb saw this morning are not raiders. They are scouts. The raid will come. I do not know in what form. I do not know on what night. But I know it is coming, and I know it is coming soon, and I owe you the chance to be on a stagecoach back to Meade's Crossing. By sundown, if that is what you choose. He laid one hand flat on the table between them, palm up. He did not reach for her. He simply opened his hand and left it there, the way a man leaves an offering on an altar he does not expect to be answered. $500, he said, a through ticket east. The ring is yours to keep or to leave. No Hawthorne will speak ill of you in this life or the next. Verity Sutcliffe Hawthorne looked down at the open hand on the table. She looked at the ring on her own finger, the thin gold band that had been Beulah Hawthorne's before it was hers. She looked at Wendell, who was not looking at her, who was staring instead into the depths of his tin cup as if the answer to a question he had carried since 1876 might at last be lying at the bottom of it. She thought of her father on the night before he died, holding her hand in his own dry, papery one, and saying for the last time, "When you do not know the road, daughter, set one foot before the other, and trust the road to find you. The Lord has not yet abandoned a brave heart." She set her hand down on top of Rufus Hawthorne's open palm. She did not take his hand. She simply laid hers across it the way one lays a stone on top of another stone to mark a place. "I have already set my foot on this mountain," she said. "I am not lifting it off again." Outside the cabin, the snow began to fall harder. Old Jeb closed the door against the cold. Wendell lifted his eyes from the cup and looked at his brother and his brother's wife, and at the small space where their two hands rested on the pine. And for the first time in 4 years, there was something behind his eyes that was not sorrow. The wind rose in the high pines. The fire burned steady, and somewhere far down the valley beyond the last of the falling snow, a man named Quincy Bramwell sat in a coal cabin at Hellfire Gulch and traced with one yellowed fingernail the line of a hand-drawn map upon which the words Cold Hollow had been circled twice. And he smiled a small, dry smile, and he said to no one in particular, "Soon." The morning after old Jeb Tannehill rode in with the warning, Verity Sutcliffe Hawthorne came down the cabin stairs at 4 o'clock with her hair already pinned and her sleeves already rolled. She found Rufus at the table with the Bible open in front of him, and Wendell standing by the kitchen window, looking out at the gray pre-dawn and a tin pot of coffee, black enough to chew, already sitting on the iron trivet between them. She sat down across from her husband. She poured herself a cup. She drank half of it before she spoke. "I am not going east," she said. "I am not asking for the $500. I am not asking for the ticket. I am asking for one thing only. I am asking you to teach me everything I do not yet know. I have a fortnight, perhaps 3. Make it count." Rufus closed the Bible. He looked at her for a long moment over the rim of his cup. Wendell did not turn from the window, but she saw his shoulders settle the smallest fraction of an inch, the way a man's shoulders settle when he has been carrying a weight for years and someone has at last come to stand beside him with a second pair of hands. "All right," Rufus said. So began the 4 weeks that the country around Cold Hollow would later remember, when it remembered them at all, as the weeks in which a Pennsylvania preacher's daughter was made into something the Wyoming snow had not seen before and would not see again. Wendell took her shooting in the morning before the sun came over the eastern ridge, when the air was still and the cold made the rifle barrel ache in her gloved hands. He started her at 60 paces and moved her back 5 paces every other day. By the end of the second week, she was hitting a tin can at 120 paces with 3 shots out of 5. He moved her then to moving targets: a pumpkin on a swinging rope, a bottle thrown by hand into the air. The pumpkin she could hit by the 3rd week. The bottle she did not hit at all in the 3rd week. She hit the bottle on the 4th shot of the 4th day of the 4th week, and Wendell, who had not laughed in front of her once in the time she had known him, laughed. "Your father would have been pleased," he said. "My father would have said the Lord guided the bullet," she said, "and he would have been wrong." Wendell laughed again. It was a strange sound. It was the laugh of a man relearning how. Rufus took her riding in the afternoons. He put her up on Mercy, the bay filly that had been her saddle horse since the 1st week, and he taught her how to sit a horse at the gallop with both hands free of the reins. He taught her how to lay flat along the horse's neck so that a rifleman from the side would have only the smallest sliver of her body to aim at. He taught her how to pull a horse out of a panicked bolt with knees alone. He taught her how to dismount it at speed by sliding off the offside and hitting the ground running, so the horse's body would shield her from a man with a pistol. On the eighth afternoon of these lessons, he stood beside her at the rail of the lower paddock to demonstrate the angle at which a man should hold a Spencer carbine when firing from horseback. He was a careful man. He was a careful teacher. He spoke to her over her shoulder rather than across her body, and his right arm came around her, not touching to indicate the line her own arm should follow. But his chest was a hand's breadth from her back. His breath was warm at her temple, and the wool of his coat brushed the wool of hers and stayed. He held that position for the space of perhaps 8 seconds. Then he stepped away. He stepped away hard, and he turned to face the long line of pines on the eastern ridge, and he said in a voice she had not heard from him before, "That is enough for today. Go inside. The wind is changing." The wind was not changing. She knew it was not changing. She also knew that she had heard the catch in his throat as he spoke, and that her own face was burning in the cold, and that something between them had shifted on the inside of an inch and would not shift back. She walked back toward the cabin. Halfway across the yard, she allowed herself one long breath, and only one. Old Jeb Tannehill taught her the country itself. 3 days a week, he came down from his cabin and took her out on horseback, and they rode the long ridges in the deep cuts, in the small hidden meadows that even Wendell did not know as well as old Jeb knew them. He showed her where the elk yarded up in winter and where the wolves denned in spring, and he showed her the 3 springs that did not freeze, and he taught her how to tell from the bark of an aspen what direction was north on a day when the sun was hidden. He taught her the names of plants. He taught her how to walk on hard-packed snow without leaving sign. He taught her on a cold blue afternoon in the first week of January the small whistle the Crow people used to signal one another in dense timber, the call that sounded almost exactly like a great horned owl, but for a small dropping note at the end that no owl in the world ever made. "If you hear this," he said, "and you have not made it yourself, lass, you will know that one of us is alive and looking for you. Whistle back. We will find each other." She practiced the whistle for 3 days before she could make it sound like an owl. By the end of the first week, she could make it sound like an owl that an owl would have answered. Old Jeb pronounced this satisfactory. In the long evenings of those 4 weeks, the cabin began to change in ways too small to see and too large to miss. Wendell began to come into the house for supper. Not every night, 2 nights the first week, 3 nights the second, 4 nights the third. By the 4th week, he came every night, and he stayed after the supper dishes were done, and he sat on the hearthstone with his back against the warm stones and his long legs stretched toward the fire, and he listened while Verity read aloud from her father's worn copy of George Herbert. And once, when she had finished a poem, he said quietly without opening his eyes, "Read that one again." She read it again. He did not open his eyes, but she watched him, and she saw a single tear track down the weathered side of his face and disappear into his beard. And she understood that he was not weeping for the poem. He was weeping for the long room of his own life that had not had a woman's voice in it for almost a decade, and that had a woman's voice in it now, reading the lines of an English country parson dead more than 200 years. She finished the poem and closed the book and did not look at him. That was the night Wendell Hawthorne began to mend. The first attack came at 2 o'clock in the morning of the second day of the new year. Wendell was on the loft watch. He had taken the loft watch for the past 8 nights, running sleeping in 2-hour snatches with the Spencer rifle laid across his thighs, his eye to the small slit between the loft boards from which the whole of the yard below could be seen. He had not slept more than 4 hours in any of those 8 nights. The cabin had grown used to the small, soft sound of him moving in the loft above the horses at any hour. What woke him on this particular night was not a sound. It was the absence of a sound. The wind off the high ridge had been blowing all evening, a steady whisper through the pines, that the cabin and the barn and every living thing in the valley had been listening to without hearing for hours. At 4 minutes past 2, the whisper stopped. Not because the wind had died. The wind had not died. The whisper stopped because something between Wendell's ear and the ridge had begun to absorb it. A body. A body where no body should be. 5 bodies, perhaps 6, moving through the deep snow at the eastern edge of the lower paddock. Wendell did not move. He laid his cheek along the stock of the Spencer and put one slow hand to his lips and made the small, dropping owl call. 3 notes. The answer came back from the cabin almost at once. 3 notes of Rufus's harmonica played so softly that no man 50 feet from the cabin would have heard it as anything but wind in a flue. The signal was set. Wendell counted the bodies one more time as they moved into the open of the yard. 5. He waited for the first to step clear of the corner of the smokehouse. The man stepped clear. Wendell shot him through the chest. The crack of the Spencer in the cold, still night was like the sky breaking. The 4 behind him scattered. 2 ran for the cabin door. 2 broke for the barn. Rufus had been at the cabin's east window since the first owl call. He took the lead man on the cabin run with 1 shot from the Winchester. The second man, a heavy-set rider with a beard, made it as far as the porch before Verity, who had come down the stairs with the 10-gauge coach gun the moment the harmonica had played, opened the front door 6 inches and gave him the right barrel at 4 feet. He went over backward off the porch into the snow and did not move again. The 2 who had broken for the barn met old Jeb Tannehill, who had come up the back trail an hour before midnight and bedded down in the empty stall at the end of the row, precisely because he had felt in his bones that this was the night. Old Jeb was 60 years old and had been in a great many quiet places in his life. The 2 men who came through the barn door looking for stock to stampede met him in the dim lamplight of the alley between the stalls, and they did not get more than 4 steps inside before old Jeb killed the first with the long Hawken rifle he had been carrying since 1849, and the second with the bone-handled Bowie that had been in his belt since his Crow wife had given it to him in 1859. 3 minutes. The whole of it took 3 minutes. Wendell came down from the loft. Rufus came out from the cabin. Old Jeb came out from the barn. The 4 of them met in the trampled snow of the yard and stood in a small, loose circle around the 4 bodies. The 5th man, the one Wendell had taken first, had crawled some 30 feet back toward the tree line, leaving a long, dark furrow behind him. He was not yet dead. He lay in the snow with his hat off and his lips moving. Verity walked over to him. She knelt. She did not put a hand near his wound. She did not speak first. The man's eyes found hers. They had a hard time focusing. He coughed once. A bright thread of blood ran out of the corner of his mouth. Bramwell, he managed. Bramwell knows about the bride. He said, now there is a woman in the house. He said the Hawthorns have given him another piece on the board. He said, he stopped. He breathed twice fast and shallow. He is taking the stallion, he said. Mum the cattle, not the land, not yet. The stallion first. To break them, to break the country. He did not say any more. The breath went out of him long and slow, and the snow caught it as a thin rising vapor, and he was gone. Verity went through the man's pockets while Rufus and Wendell and old Jeb dragged the other 4 bodies into the empty corn crib behind the smokehouse where the coal would keep them until the marshal could be sent for. She found in the inside breast pocket of the dead man's coat a single folded paper sealed with a crude wax wafer that had broken in 2 when the man had fallen. She unfolded the paper at the kitchen table by the light of the lamp. She read it once. She read it twice. The lamp shook in her hand because her hand had begun to shake. Rufus came in stamping the snow from his boots. He saw her face. He crossed the room. What is it? She handed him the paper. The paper was a sketch in pencil of the Hawthorne yard. The barn marked, the cabin marked, the smokehouse marked, the spring house marked, the 2 windows of the upstairs bedroom carefully labeled bride, the rotation of the loft watch laid out by hour, a note at the bottom in a small, spidery hand. The handwriting was the handwriting of a man Verity had known since she was 9 years old. The handwriting was the handwriting of her brother-in-law, the handwriting of Lemuel Pickett. He used me, she said. The words came out of her before she had decided to say them. He used me to find this house. He sold me. He sold me to the man who killed your father. Rufus folded the paper very carefully. He laid it on the kitchen table. He turned and laid both his hands on her shoulders. And this was the first time in 94 days of marriage that he had taken hold of her with the deliberate intention of taking hold. And she felt the weight of his hands settle on her like the weight of a roof being lowered onto walls that had been waiting all along to receive it. No, he said quietly. He did not use you to find this house. The man who used you was already finding this house before your stagecoach left Lancaster. You were the last piece he set on the board. You were not the reason for the game. She lifted her face to his. She did not cry. She was past crying for a while. I am the reason it is happening now, she said. Yes, he said. You are also the reason it will not finish the way he wants it to finish. He did not plan for what walked off that stagecoach. He planned for a town girl who would scream when the board started to splinter. He did not plan for you. She did not answer that. She only stood for a long moment with her forehead against the front of his coat, and he did not move, and his hands stayed on her shoulders. And somewhere in the cabin behind them, Wendell was moving softly, putting fresh wood in the stove, the way a man does when he has come into a room and found his brother holding his sister-in-law for the first time and has decided to let the moment have the time it needs. The United States Marshal arrived 3 days later. His name was Tobias Renfrew, and he had ridden up from the territorial office in Cheyenne with 2 deputies on the strength of a telegram old Jeb had carried down to Meade's Crossing the morning after the attack. Renfrew was 55 years old. He had a long gray mustache and a long gray coat and the long, flat eyes of a man who had been chasing the same handful of bad men across the same handful of mountain ranges for more years than he cared to count. He had been chasing Quincy Bramwell in particular for 4 of those years. He looked at the 4 bodies in the corn crib. He looked at the sketch on the kitchen table. He drank a cup of Verity's coffee in the kitchen and listened to her account of the night without interrupting once. When she had finished, he set the cup down and looked at Rufus. Lemuel Pickett, he said. You know the name, Rufus said. I know the man. He lost $1,800 across a faro table in Cheyenne in the spring of last year. The man who took the $1,800 off him was Boone Doggett, who was Bramwell's right hand. Pickett could not pay. He has been paying instead in information ever since. Land titles, bank accounts, the locations of profitable small ranches on which a quiet man with a pencil might gather useful intelligence. When your wife answered Mr. Hawthorne's letter, Pickett saw a way to turn one debt into 2 satisfactions. He paid down what he owed Doggett, and he did harm to a sister-in-law who had once cost him a fight at her father's dinner table. I have been gathering papers on Pickett for 6 months. I can put him in front of a judge any day I find him. The trouble has always been finding him. Verity said, He is with Bramwell. He is with Bramwell, Renfrew agreed, which means I cannot find him until I find Bramwell, which means we are all of us looking for the same man for slightly different reasons. He set his hat back on his head. Bramwell is at Hellfire Gulch. I have known this for 6 weeks. I have not been able to ride in there because Hellfire is an old played-out gold mine with one narrow entrance and a population on any given night of between 25 and 40 armed men. I have a federal warrant. I do not have an army. The warrant does me very little good if I cannot serve it without losing every deputy in the territory. He looked at Rufus across the table. If you are willing to ride with me, Mr. Hawthorne and your brother is willing, and that Scotchman in the barn is willing, we may be able to do together what none of us can do alone. But I will not ask it of you, and I will not ask it of your wife. The choice is yours. Rufus did not look at his brother. He did not need to. We will ride, he said. The plan took 6 days to make. It was old Jeb who supplied the piece that made the plan possible. He had ridden through Hellfire Gulch in 1872, when the camp was still working a thin vein of color, and he remembered a thing about the place that none of the current residents had reason to remember. The main entrance to the gulch was through a narrow defile from the south, the only practical way for a horse and rider. But there was a second way in. A timber shoring in the back wall of the upper drift had been driven in the early years of the camp all the way through the ridge and out the other side in the hope of catching a richer vein. The vein had not been found. The drift had been abandoned. The far end had been timbered over and forgotten. But the tunnel was still there. Old Jeb had walked it once on a wager from the backside to the front. It was, he said, a tight crawl in 3 places. A man of average size could make it through. A man of Rufus Hawthorne's size could make it through if he was determined and did not panic. A small woman could make it through with no trouble at all. This was the kind of plan Renfro said that he had been looking for 4 years. While the men drew the maps and counted the cartridges and mapped out fields of fire, Verity took on the small, sober task that she alone could perform. She rode down to Meade's Crossing on the 7th of January on Mercy, with Wendell trailing her at half a mile and old Jeb trailing Wendell at the same distance, and she went into the stage station at a small layover hut called Old Tucker's Halfway, where the keeper was a man named Ulysses Tucker, who was Renfro had quietly explained on Bramwell's payroll for $5 a week and a bottle of bourbon. Verity sat in Tucker's small front room for 40 minutes, warming her hands at his stove. She made a great show of being tired. She made a great show of being worried. She let it be understood in the manner of a young wife who has had no one to talk to in weeks that her husband and his brother were planning a desperate thing in the next several nights. She let drop, as if she could not hold the words back, that the Hawthorns were planning to move the Black Stallion down off the mountain to the railhead at Cheyenne for safekeeping, and that they were planning to do it on the night of the 11th, and that they were planning to take him out by the South Trail through Crow's Pass because the main road was too watched. She let her ring catch the lamplight when she said it. She let her eyes fill once. She apologized for the weight of her own troubles. She drank Tucker's coffee. She rode back up the mountain. Behind her, before her horse had cleared the last bend of the trail, Ulysses Tucker was on his own pony heading north at a hard trot toward the second turn off below Hellfire Gulch. The lie was sown. The trap was set. The trap, of course, was a feint. The men of Bramwell's band, drawn by the prospect of the stallion crossing through Crow's Pass on the night of the 11th, would ride south to ambush a column that would not exist. Renfro and his deputies, with Hank Whittlesey and Cyril Beach, the 2 Hawthorne hands, and a half-dozen sworn citizens from Meade's Crossing, would meet that ambush from the rear and turn it into a rout. Meanwhile, on the north side of the same ridge, Rufus and Wendell and Old Jeb and Verity would slip into Hellfire Gulch, through the abandoned drift, take Bramwell himself in his cabin with whatever skeleton crew he had left behind, and have the head of the snake before any of the body knew the head was gone. That was the plan. It was a good plan. It had the small, clean shape of all good plans before contact. The night of the 11th of January was the coldest night of the winter so far. The wind off the Absaroka came down through the pines with a high keening note that the old-timers of Meade's Crossing said sounded like a woman who had lost something she could not get back. The snow began at sundown. By 8 o'clock, it was coming sideways. By 10 o'clock, the visibility had dropped to 30 feet. This was the weather they had wanted. This was the weather that would muffle hooves, kill sound-blind eyes, and turn a mountain ridge into the single useful ally of 4 people moving in single file along its spine. They left Cold Hollow at 9 p.m. Rufus and Wendell and Old Jeb and Verity, 4 horses, 4 rifles, 4 sidearms, 4 sets of climbing irons lashed to the saddles in case the back ridge required them. Hank Whittlesey was holding the cabin with Cyril Beach and the 2 cattle dogs. The cabin was locked from the inside. The shutters were down. It took them 4 hours to cover the 8 miles of broken country to the backside of Hellfire Ridge. Old Jeb led. He led as if the ridge were a corridor of his mother's house, and he had walked it every night of his childhood. They tied the horses in a small thicket of jack pines on the lee side of the ridge. They went the last quarter mile on foot, single file, Old Jeb in front, Wendell second, Verity third, Rufus last. The wind cut their faces. The snow came in flat, horizontal sheets that hissed against the canvas of their coats. The mouth of the abandoned drift was where Old Jeb said it would be, behind a fallen tangle of timber that had once been a small rail trestle and was now a heap of frozen sticks. They cleared the timber with their gloved hands in a steady silence that lasted some 20 minutes. Behind the timber, the drift opened into the ridge like an old wound. The wind stopped at the threshold. Inside, the air was still and dry and smelled of stone. Old Jeb lit a small bullseye lantern. He shielded the beam with his hand. "It is 600 feet through," he said in a low voice. "The first 100 is easy walking. The middle 300 is bent. The last 200 you crawl. The last 20 feet is timbered over from the inside. I cut it loose 2 summers ago when I last walked it, and I tucked the timbers back to look as they were. They will come away with one hand." He looked at each of them in turn. "After the timber, there is the back of an old shaft house. Bramwell's people use it for stores. There is generally one man on the door. From the door, you have a clear walk of about 40 yards along the back side of the camp to Bramwell's cabin. The cabin sits above the others on the north slope, easy to find. There are 2 windows. If your timing is the timing we have agreed upon, the camp will be empty of all but the cooks and the wounded, and Bramwell's personal guard, and most of the personal guard will be on the south wall, watching the wrong direction. And if our timing is not the timing we have agreed upon," Rufus said. "Then we pray," old Jeb said, "and we shoot well." Wendell almost laughed. Almost. They went into the drift. The first 100 feet was as old Jeb had said, walking. The middle 300 was bent walking, so that Rufus had to bend nearly double, and Wendell, who was shorter, only had to stoop. The last 200 they crawled. Verity went first in the crawl because she was the smallest, and because if there had been any obstacle ahead, she had the best chance of seeing it before they all got stuck behind it. The lantern was passed to her. She held it before her in one hand and pulled herself along on her elbows and knees with the other. The cold rock pressed up through the knees of her dress. The roof of the drift pressed down a hand's breadth above her head. She heard her own breathing very loud. She heard the scuff of the men behind her. She heard nothing else at all. It was in the 18th minute of that crawl that she became for the first time in her life a soldier. She did not know what to call it then. She only knew that something inside her chest, which had been frightened for 97 days, sat down quietly in some interior room and closed the door behind it. What remained outside the door was clean and small and useful. A woman on her knees with a lantern in her hand who had a job to do and would do it. She pushed forward. The timbered face at the inside end of the drift came away with one hand, as old Jeb had promised. She set the timbers gently aside one by one and laid them flat. She put the lantern out. She pushed her head through the gap. She was looking at the inside of the back wall of an old shaft house. Lamplight came through the cracks of the plank wall, dim and yellow. She heard very near the slow, heavy breathing of a man asleep on his feet. She drew her head back. She made 3 small motions with her hand toward Rufus behind her. She slid sideways out of the drift into the space between the drift and the plank wall, a space perhaps 2 feet wide and fragrant with old timbers and tobacco juice and rats. Wendell came through after her without a sound. Rufus followed. Old Jeb came last and stopped at the mouth of the drift to keep a way of retreat clear. Wendell drew his bowie. He set the tip of the blade to the planks where the lamplight told him a sleeping shoulder rested on the other side. He looked at Verity. She nodded. Wendell pushed the door of the shaft house open with his shoulder and stepped through and laid the man on the floor with one short motion of the knife to the side of the throat. The man did not cry out. The man, in fact, never quite woke up. Wendell wiped the bowie clean on the dead man's shirt and stepped back. They stood in the back room of Quincy Bramwell's stronghold. Outside, far off to the south, they heard it begin, the distant pop of rifles down in the dark of Crow's Pass. The trap had been sprung. Marshal Renfro had engaged. Rufus checked the cylinder of his pistol one final time. He looked at his wife. He looked at his brother. He looked at the door. "The cabin," he said. "Now." They went out into the snow. They had taken 6 steps along the back wall of the shaft house, moving low under the eaves when Verity Hawthorne stopped. She stopped because something in the count of the night had gone wrong inside her head, and the wrongness of it had stopped her boots before her brain had told her why. She caught Rufus's sleeve. She pulled him down behind the corner of the shaft house. Wendell came up beside them without a sound. Old Jeb closed up at the rear. "Listen," she whispered. They listened. The rifles to the south were popping at the rate of 4 or 5 a minute. Steady, heavy, the unmistakable sound of a real engagement with men firing in volleys and being fired upon. But there were almost no answering shots from the gulch above them. None. Not one. The camp behind them was quiet as a Sunday. The few lamps that were burning steady. No men were running. No men were calling for horses. No men were saddling up to go reinforce the ambush at Crow's Pass. "He did not send them south," Verity said. Her voice was very low. Her voice was very flat. "He did not believe Tucker, or he believed him and saw the lie inside the lie. He did not send the camp south. The men firing at Renfro are a screen, a small party, 20 men, maybe fewer. The rest of them, Rufus, listen, the rest of them are not here." Rufus was already turning. He was already moving. Wendell understood a half second behind him. Old Jeb understood at the same instant. "They are at the cabin," Rufus said. "They are at Cold Hollow. They left an hour before us. They have been there an hour already while we crawled through that hole in the ground." He looked at his wife. His wife's face was very white, but her eyes were the eyes that had stayed clean and small and useful in the long crawl. The eyes of the soldier. "Hank," she said. "Hank and Cyril, the dogs. They went to the cabin for the stallion." "They went to the cabin for the stallion," Rufus said. The four of them turned and ran back along the back wall of the shaft house into the timbered drift, through the dark and the bent crawl, and the long stooping middle and the easy first 100 feet of the way. They had come faster than any of them had ever moved through any tunnel before. While behind them in the snow, a marshal of the United States and his deputies and a half-dozen citizens of Meade's Crossing kept on firing into the dark at 20 hired men who did not know that they themselves were the small price Quincy Bramwell had been willing to pay to take while the iron of Hawthorne was 40 miles from its own doorstep, the one thing he had wanted from the start. They reached the horses at the lee of the ridge. They mounted. They turned south. The wind hit them in the face like the open hand of God. They put their heels to the horses and they rode. Behind them, Hellfire Gulch settled back into its lamp-lit silence, and the distant rifles in Crow's Pass kept on speaking, and Quincy Bramwell, 8 miles ahead of them in the snow with 12 picked men and a fresh halter for a $6,000 horse, did not yet know that he was being followed. He would know soon. The country between Hellfire Ridge and Cold Hollow was 34 miles by the long road and 21 miles by the cuts only Old Jeb and Wendell knew. They took the cuts. The wind was at their faces for the first 11 miles and at their right shoulders for the last 10. The snow turned their coats white. The horses' nostrils ran with frozen foam. Mercy beneath Verity found a second wind at mile 15 and a third wind at mile 19, the way good horses sometimes do when their riders have asked them honestly and have not lied about how much further it would be. They came down the last switchback above Cold Hollow at 5 minutes past 4 in the morning. The snow had thinned. The moon, which had been hidden all night, had broken through the racing cloud for the space of perhaps half an hour. By that thin gray moonlight, they saw the yard of the home that had been built by their father for his sons, and for his sons' wives, and for his grandchildren, who had not yet been born. There was a string of horses at the rail by the barn, 12 horses. They were not Hawthorne horses. The barn door stood open. The lamplight inside it was the lamplight of strangers. A man on the porch of the cabin was standing with a long stack in his hand, and as they reined to a halt above the trail bend, that man drove the long stick down through a window pane that was already broken, and he laughed a small, dry laugh that was somehow audible across the still yard. The laugh of a man who had at last reached the end of a 4-year hunt and was about to take what he had come for. Beside Verity, Rufus Hawthorne drew his rifle from its scabbard, and the slow, even click of the lever as he chambered around was the loudest sound that had ever been made on the mountain in her hearing. "Ride," he said. "Ride hard." She rode. They came down the last quarter mile of the trail at a flat run. Mercy, who had carried Verity 21 miles through a winter night that would have killed a lesser horse, found a fourth wind on that last quarter mile, and Verity bent low along the bay's neck and felt the small filly's heart thunder against her own thigh. And she thought in the small, clean room inside her chest where the soldier had been sitting since the crawl through the drift of nothing at all, except the man on the porch with the long stick in his hand. The man on the porch was Quincy Bramwell. She had never seen his face. She knew him at once. He was a tall man, thinner than she had imagined, in a long black oilskin coat that came down nearly to his boot tops. He wore a flat-brimmed Confederate cavalry hat that had been bleached gray by 20 years of weather. The hand that held the long stick was a long, bony hand. The other hand held a Colt revolver loosely at his hip, the way a man holds a tool he has been using all his working life. There were 11 men in the yard with him, 3 at the cabin door, 2 at the barn. 6 at the corral, where 2 of Hawthorne's brood mares had already been roped out of the lower paddock, and a third was being driven up the chute toward the open gate. But there were not 12 men. There were 11, and Verity, riding down at the head of the 4 of them with the blood of the long ride in her ears, understood as her boots came clear of the stirrups that the 12th man, and the one she had been counting on most, was not in the yard at all. She did not yet know where Lemuel Pickett was. She would know in 3 minutes. The first shot of the engagement came from Wendell Hawthorne. He had pulled up his roan 30 paces behind Verity and behind Rufus on the small rise that gave the yard down below, in clean view, and he had laid the Spencer across the pommel of his saddle and breathed out slow, and his first shot took the man at the barn door through the throat at 140 paces, and his second shot, while the man was still falling, took the second man at the barn door through the side of the head before that man had heard the report of the first. The yard came alive. 11 suddenly was 9. Bramwell turned on the porch. He did not fire. He was a man who had been in many gunfights in his life and had learned that a man who fires before he sees does not live to fire often. He took 2 slow steps off the porch and shouted 3 words to the corral, and the 6 men there abandoned the brood mares and broke for cover behind the long wood pile. Rufus rode straight at him. He was 30 yards from the porch when Bramwell raised the Colt. He was 20 yards when Bramwell inspired the first round. He was 15 yards when the second round took Rufus's hat off his head, clean as a barber's razor. At 10 yards, Rufus came out of the saddle in a long, flat dive and hit the snow rolling and came up on one knee with the Winchester at his shoulder. And his first shot took the post 6 inches above Bramwell's left ear, and his second shot took the man who had stepped from inside the cabin door directly behind Bramwell, and on the third shot, Bramwell dove off the side of the porch into the cover of the woodpile with the men from the corral. The yard became, for the next 14 minutes, the kind of fight that frontier men of that generation called a confusion. Verity reached the corner of the smokehouse and slid off Mercy and slapped the filly hard on the rump to send her clear. Mercy bolted into the trees behind the springhouse. Verity ducked behind the corner of the smokehouse with the Winchester in her hand. From this position, she could see the back door of the cabin. The back door of the cabin was open 6 inches. It had been kicked off the bottom hinge. Through the gap in the door, she could see, lying on the floor of the kitchen, the still arm and shoulder of Hank Whittlesey. He was not moving. She did not yet see Cyril. She did not see the dogs. She moved to the corner of the spring house. She moved to the corner of the smokehouse on the far side. She came up to the back porch in 3 short rushes between cover, and at the back porch she dropped flat behind the kindling rick, and she lay there with her cheek pressed against a stick of frozen pine and listened. She heard inside the cabin a voice she had not heard in 9 months, a voice she had hoped not to hear again in this life or the next. "Verity," the voice called. "Verity, dear, are you out there yet? You always were a smart one. I told them you would come." It was Lemuel Picketed. He was inside her cabin. He was inside her kitchen. He was speaking from a position no more than 15 feet from where she lay. She closed her eyes for the space of one slow breath. She opened them again. The soldier inside her chest stood up and walked forward to the door of the small, clean room and laid one hand on the frame and waited. "I have your man Whittlesey here on the floor," Pickett called. "He took a ball through the leg when he tried to make a run for the rifle rack. He is alive. Your other man, the one with the limp, took a ball through the neck and is at the kitchen table looking quite dead. The dogs are in the root cellar. I shut them in. They are barking. Can you hear them?" She could hear them. The distant, muffled barking of Boaz and Ruth somewhere under the floor of the kitchen, frantic and trapped. "Verity," Pickett called again. "I want you to come inside, dear. I want you to come inside with your hands empty. If you come inside with your hands empty in the next 60 seconds, I will leave Whittlesey and the dogs alive, and I will ride out of here with the stallion, and your sister will be avenged in the only way that I have ever cared about. If you do not come inside in the next 60 seconds, I will put a ball through the back of Whittlesey's head, and I will let the dogs starve in the dark. Do you hear me, dear?" Verity Hawthorne lay behind the kindling rick with the Winchester in her right hand and her left hand pressed flat against the cold porch boards. She thought of Cordelia, her sister who had died in childbirth in the autumn of 1874, a girl of 19 with this man weeping at her bedside. She thought of how Lemuel Pickett had wept that night. She thought of how she had believed at the age of 17 that the weeping was real. She thought of her father on the night before he died, holding her hand and saying that the Lord had not yet abandoned a brave heart. She rolled onto her back. She slid the Winchester onto the porch boards above her head. She stood up empty-handed and walked around the kindling rick and up the 3 steps of the back porch with her hands open at her sides. She pushed the cabin door open with her shoulder. Lemuel Pickett was standing in the middle of her kitchen with a small nickel-plated revolver in his right hand. The barrel of the revolver was at the back of Hank Whittlesey's head. Hank was on his knees with his hands on his thighs and his face white as paper, and his right leg below the knee was a black mess of blood, but his eyes, when they met Verity's, were clear. "Verity," Pickett said. He smiled. "I will be honest, I did not think you would come." She did not answer. She kept her hands open. She watched the small nickel-plated revolver. "Where is Cyril?" she said. "At the table. Where I told you. Quite dead as I said. He took the first ball before Hank even had his pants on. And the stallion?" "The stallion is in the barn with my colleague Doggett. We will be leaving with him in a few minutes. You will be coming with us, dear, as far as the railhead at Cheyenne at least. Mr. Bramwell wishes to discuss with your husband when next he sees him the fair price of one black stallion against the safe return of one young wife. He thinks the negotiation either will go more smoothly if the wife is present at the start of it." She moved one step into the kitchen. She kept her hands at her sides. "Lemuel," she said, "Cordelia would be ashamed of you." His face did not change, but his hand on the revolver tightened and Hank Whittlesey closed his eyes. "Cordelia is dead," Pickett said. "Cordelia has been dead for 5 years. The dead do not have shame. The dead do not have anything. The living have $1,800 gambling debts, and the living have men like Boone Doggett, who collect those debts in pieces if they are not paid in coin. You do not lecture me, Verity. You sat in your father's parlor on your widow's pension while I went out into the world. You do not lecture me about my wife. My father," Verity said, "did not leave me a widow's pension. He left me $1,800 in a savings account at the Lancaster Trust. You took it. I took what was owed to me. You took what belonged to me, and you sold me to a murderer to cover the rest." Pickett's lip lifted just slightly at one corner. The expression was not quite a smile. "And here you are," he said, "in a kitchen on a mountain in Wyoming, with a ring on your finger, with color in your cheeks, with a Winchester rifle on the back porch. Tell me, Verity, was I not the best thing that ever happened to you? Did I not bring you home?" She did not let her face change. She did not let her hands come up. She moved one step further into the kitchen, and now she was perhaps 4 feet from him, and she said in a voice that was quieter than the small voice he had used himself, "Lemuel, look at the doorway behind me." He did not move. He was not a stupid man. "That is the oldest trick into the book, dear." "It is," and yet he did not turn his head, but his eyes, just for an instant, flicked past her shoulder. That was the instant Wendell Hawthorne took him. Wendell had come around the side of the cabin while Pickett was speaking. He had come up the back porch on the softness of long practice. He was standing in the open kitchen doorway behind Verity with the bone-handled Bowie in his right hand and a Colt revolver in his left. His left arm came up slow and steady as the arm of a clock. The Colt fired once. The ball went through Lemuel Pickett's right wrist. The nickel-plated revolver dropped onto Hank Whittlesey's shoulder and clattered to the kitchen floor. Pickett went down on one knee with a high, thin sound that did not sound like a man. Verity took 2 long steps and kicked the nickel-plated revolver across the kitchen. Wendell came into the room. He did not look at Pickett. He went to Hank, and he laid one hand on Hank's shoulder, and he said in his quiet voice, "All right, brother, all right. The leg first." Outside the cabin, the firing in the yard had not stopped. It had risen, in fact. Rufus and old Jeb were still pinned behind the corner of the smokehouse and the corner of the woodshed, respectively. Bramwell and 7 of his men were still behind the long wood pile in the corner of the corral. The stallion was still in the barn. Boondoggle was still with him. Verity did not say any of this aloud. She picked up the nickel-plated revolver from the floor and dropped it into the wood box. She picked up Pickett's discarded coat from the chair where he had laid it and went through the pockets and found in the inside breast pocket a folded paper that was the writ of sale on which Quincy Bramwell would have transferred the Hawthorne Ranch to the Continental Stock Association on the morning Verity was returned to Cheyenne. She folded the paper smaller and put it in the bodice of her dress. She picked up Wendell's Spencer rifle from where he had set it against the wall when he came in, and she walked back out onto the back porch, and she took up the Winchester from the porch boards where she had laid it, and she walked around the side of the cabin to the corner of the smokehouse where her husband was crouched. "Hank is alive," she said. "Cyril is dead. The dogs are in the cellar. Pickett is on the kitchen floor with a ball through the wrist. Wendell is with them. Doggett is in the barn." Rufus, who had been firing a careful husbanding fire, lowered his rifle for the space of one breath. "And Bramwell is behind the wood pile, where he was. Did he see you go in?" He did not. Rufus nodded. He looked at her in the gray dawn light. The dawn that had come on without anyone in the yard noticing it had come, and his face was so still that for a moment she did not recognize it. Then she did. It was the face of a man who had been carrying a weight on his shoulders since the day his father was found at the foot of the bluffs above Meade's Crossing in the spring of 1875, and who understood, as the sky paled behind the eastern ridge, that today was the day he would either set the weight down or be killed by it. "Old Jeb," he called softly across the yard. The Scotchman's voice came back from behind the woodshed. "Aye." "The barn. Dog it, now. I will give you the long fire." "Aye." Rufus turned and laid the Winchester along the corner of the smokehouse and began a steady rhythm of fire into the woodpile, one shot every 4 seconds, not aimed at any particular man, but aimed to keep every head behind it from rising. Behind him, very quickly, old Jeb came out from the woodshed and went around the back of the spring house and came up the blind side of the barn and went in through the small side door that the Hawthorne brothers had cut for the cats in the spring of 1872. There was a single shot inside the barn, a shot from a long Hawken rifle. There was a sound after it that was not a shot, a sound like a sack of grain coming off a hay rack. There was no second shot. Boondoggle, who had run with Quincy Bramwell from Missouri to Texas to the Wyoming Territory and had killed 11 men for him along the way, did not run with him any further. Old Jeb came out of the side door of the barn leading Black Sovereign by the halter. The stallion was unhurt. He was in fact in a remarkably composed temper. Old Jeb walked him around the back of the barn and into the small fenced run behind the spring house where he could not be seen from the woodpile. He closed the gate behind him. Then old Jeb took up his position at the corner of the spring house with the long Hawken reloaded. Behind the woodpile, Quincy Bramwell understood perhaps 30 seconds later that his man was not coming out of the barn. He understood perhaps 15 seconds after that the long fire from the smokehouse was steady and accurate and had been pinning him for the better part of 20 minutes. He understood finally that he had committed the cardinal sin of the small army commander, which was to spend his reserves before he had taken the position they were meant to hold. He lifted his head 3 inches above the wood pile to look at the smokehouse. Old Jeb's Hawken, from the spring house corner 110 paces to the side of him, took the hat off his head as cleanly as Bramwell's own pistol had taken the hat off Rufus 30 minutes before. The four men still alive behind the woodpile threw down their rifles. Quincy Bramwell did not throw down his rifle. He stood up slowly behind the woodpile with the Spencer carbine in his right hand and the Colt in his left, and he walked out into the open of the yard with both weapons held loose at his sides. He was a tall man walking against the dawn light in a long black coat. He stopped in the center of the yard. He looked toward the smokehouse. He looked toward the spring house. He looked toward the cabin porch. "Hawthorne," he called. His voice was thin and clear in the cold morning. "Come and look at me." Rufus Hawthorne stepped out from behind the smokehouse. He held the Winchester at his hip. "Your father," Bramwell called, "begged for the lives of his sons before he went over the bluff. Did anyone ever tell you that, boy? He did not beg for his own life. He was not that kind of man. He begged for yours. He asked me the very last thing whether his sons would be all right. I did not tell him. I did not know yet whether his sons would be all right or not. Now I know." Rufus did not answer. He lifted the Winchester from his hip to his shoulder. Bramwell brought up the Spencer at the same moment. There was, for the space of one slow second, the shape of two men in a frontier yard at sunrise, 50 feet apart, with rifles at their shoulders, and the snow still falling lightly between them. The Spencer in Quincy Bramwell's hand never quite reached the level it needed to reach. The shot from the corner of the spring house where old Jeb Tannehill had been waiting for 4 years for this exact instant took Bramwell through the chest just under the breastbone. He took one step backward. He took another step backward. He sat down in the snow with the Spencer across his lap and the Colt still in his left hand. He looked with what mild surprise he was capable of down at the front of his coat. He coughed once. He fell over sideways. He did not move again. The yard, after a long moment, became silent. The four men behind the woodpile remained still on their knees with their hands on their heads. The two of Bramwell's men who had been pinned behind the corral threw out their pistols and came forward with their hands up. The barn was silent. The cabin was silent. The dogs in the cellar had stopped barking. Marshal Tobias Renfrow came up the trail from Crow's Pass at 7:30 that morning with 8 prisoners on a tow line behind him and 3 of his deputies wounded and one of the Meads Crossing volunteers dead. He took one look at the yard and at the bodies and at the line of men kneeling beside the woodpile, and he climbed down from his horse, and he did not say a word for 2 full minutes. He simply stood and looked. Then he said, "Mr. Hawthorne." "Marshal." "It would appear, sir, that you have saved the territorial government a considerable amount of paperwork." "It would appear so." "I will require Mr. Pickett alive if possible." "He is alive. He is on the kitchen floor with a ball through his wrist. My brother is with him." Renfrow nodded slowly. He looked at Verity, who was standing at the corner of the smokehouse beside her husband, and he touched the brim of his hat to her in a gesture that was not flirtation and not paternal kindness, but something simpler and older, the gesture a man of that century made to a woman who had walked into a place of fire and walked out again. "Mrs. Hawthorne." "Marshal." "I will need a written account when you are able. There will be a federal trial at Cheyenne in the spring. Your testimony will end Mr. Pickett's career, and with the writ I expect to find in his possession, will untangle a great many bad land deeds across two territories. I will not press you for it today. You will have it tomorrow, Marshal. That will do. He looked at her a moment longer, then he turned and went about his marshal's work, which on that morning was considerable. Lemuel Pickett was tried in the federal court at Cheyenne in May of 1880. He was convicted on 17 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. He was sentenced to 25 years at the Wyoming Territorial Penitentiary at Laramie. He served 7 of those years. He died of pneumonia in his cell in the winter of 1887, along with no visitors. The $1,800 that had been Verity's was recovered from a private bank vault in Denver 3 months after his arrest and was returned to her with interest in a wax-sealed envelope she did not open for 2 years. The Continental Stock Association was dissolved by federal decree in the summer of 1880. The land titles it had held in fraud were over the next 4 years returned to the families from whom they had been taken or to the heirs of those families. Asa Mercer got his stallion back. The Brennan place was deeded back to the eldest Brennan son who came west again from Iowa in the spring of 1881 to take it up. Quincy Bramwell was buried at Meads Crossing under a wooden marker that read only the name in the year of his death. No one in the country went out to put flowers on the grave. The grave was by the spring of 1882, indistinguishable from the prairie around it. The 4 weeks after the fight passed in Cold Hollow in a kind of slow, patient quiet that the cabin had not known in many years. Hank Whittlesey's leg mended. He walked with a limp the rest of his life. He stayed on at the Hawthorne Ranch as foreman until the spring of 1909, when he died at his own kitchen table at the age of 64 with his wife beside him. Cyril Beach was buried in the small clearing behind the spring house beside the graves of Captain Cyrus Hawthorne and his wife Beulah and the 3 Hawthorne dogs that had been buried there over the previous 20 years. The Reverend Ambrose Halliday came up the mountain to read the service. He stayed for supper afterward. He pronounced Verity's pot roast the best he had eaten in 12 years on the circuit. In April, the snow began to go off the south slopes. In the second week of April, the first crocuses came up along the creek at the edge of the lower meadow. In the third week of April, on a morning when the air smelled for the first time since October of something other than wood smoke and snow, Verity went down to the foaling stall in the small barn to check on a Morgan mare that had been in slow labor since the small hours of the night. The foal was wrong. The foal was breeched. The mare had been laboring for 6 hours and was beginning to fail. Verity rolled up her sleeves to the shoulder. She washed her hands and forearms in the bucket of warm water Hank had left at the stall door. She knelt in the clean straw and she laid one hand on the heaving flank of the mare, and she spoke to the mare in the same low murmur of nonsense and comfort she had heard her father use 30 years ago in a lamplit barn in Pennsylvania. The mare's breathing slowed. The white of her eyes softened. Verity slid her right arm slowly inside the laboring animal until her shoulder was at the lip of the womb, and her small, clean fingers found the small, hot, wet body of the foal, and she found the angle of the pelvis where the hindquarters had wedged. She turned the foal. She turned it slow and patient by half a degree at a time. She did not breathe for what felt like a long time. She felt the mare bear down once. She felt the foal slip free of her fingers and into the long muscular contraction of the birth canal the right way head first. The way it had been meant to come. 2 minutes later, a black colt slid into the straw at her knees alive and shivering and indignant. Verity cleared its mouth with her finger. The foal coughed. The mare lifted her head and saw what she had made and gave one low, grateful nicker and laid her head back down on the straw. When Verity rose from her knees, smeared to the elbows in blood and birth and clean straw, exhausted, smiling, she found Rufus Hawthorne standing in the open door of the foaling stall watching her. He had been watching, she understood, for some time. He had not spoken because he had not wanted to startle the mare. He had not moved because he had been for the length of the long minutes that the turning had taken unable to. She walked to the stall door. She wiped her forearms on the rough towel that hung from the post. She came out into the broad center alley of the barn where the morning light was slanting and low and gold through the hayloft window and she stopped 2 feet from her husband and said nothing. He looked at her for a long moment. "Verity," he said. "Yes. I have a question to ask you." "Ask it. Will you stay?" He stepped forward. He took her face between his two large hands, and the small finger of his right hand, which ended at the second knuckle from a long ago winter when he had been a boy, brushed the soft place behind her ear, and he kissed her. It was the first time. It was not the last. Across the yard, Wendell Hawthorne, walking from the cabin to the barn, with a fresh bucket of mash for the mare, stopped at the well and saw his brother and his sister-in-law in the doorway of the barn, and he set the bucket down on the well stones, and he stood with both his hands on the cold iron pump handle, and he watched. After a moment he smiled. It was the smile of a man who had, in the long winter just past, finally come back from a war that had been over for 4 years and that he had been carrying inside himself like a second heart. He picked up the bucket, he turned and walked back to the cabin to give the moment its room. The Reverend Ambrose Halliday rode up the mountain again on a Sunday in May. There was a second wedding that Sunday at Verity's quiet request in the meadow above the cabin where the crocuses had come up thickest. There was no document. There was no register. There was only a man and a woman and a circuit preacher and a brother and a Scotchman and 3 ranch hands and 2 dogs and the words of an old service spoken twice in the same lifetime, the second time with a kiss. Old Jeb Tannehill brought a small package to the cabin in the 3rd week of June. He set it on the kitchen table without ceremony. He took off his hat. He sat down in the chair Verity pulled out for him. He drank a cup of coffee. He looked at the table. He looked at the package. He looked at Rufus and at Wendell and at Verity in turn. "I have carried this for 4 years," he said. "I have not given it before because I did not think the time was right. The time, lads, is right." He pushed the package across the table. Inside was a small leather-bound notebook in the unmistakable hand of Captain Maurice Hawthorne. The last entries were dated in March of 1875, in the week before he was killed. They contained in the careful copperplate of an army officer the quiet and methodical preparations of a man who had known he was being hunted and who had known he might not live long enough to tell his sons what he was doing. There was a deed in the notebook. The deed was for 480 acres of high ground 5 miles north of Cold Hollow, registered under the name of a Boston trustee with no apparent connection to any Hawthorne living. The land contained a small but reliable hot mineral spring, the only water source in the western Absarokas that did not freeze in winter. Captain Hawthorne had purchased it quietly in the autumn of 1874. He had paid for it in coin. He had not entered the purchase in any of the working ledgers of the ranch. He had told no one, not even old Jeb, because he had wanted, if the worst came, for there to be at least one piece of land in the family name that the man who killed him would not be able to find. There was a letter folded inside the notebook. The letter was addressed in his hand to my sons. Rufus read the letter aloud at the kitchen table. His voice was steady for most of it. It was steady all the way to the last paragraph. It broke very slightly at the last paragraph, and he handed the letter to Wendell, and Wendell read the rest of it. The land, the letter said, was for the boys to keep their best mares through the worst winters. The hot spring would water stock no other water in the country could water in February. It was not a fortune, the letter said. It was a hedge. It was a thing a careful man set aside for his sons in case the rest of the world went hard. Verity, who had not cried since the morning she had walked into a cabin and laid her face against the front of her husband's coat in the dark of January, sat at the table with her hand in her husband's hand and let 2 slow tears track down her face without bothering to wipe them away. The land was Sovereign Springs after that. They added the 480 acres to the home place in the spring of 1881. They built a small line cabin on the rim that Captain Cyrus Hawthorne had stood on with both his sons on his shoulders, and from the rim of that cabin on a clear day in any season, you could look down the long valley and see Cold Hollow lying in its small green pocket of the Absaroka, with the smoke rising straight from the stone chimney as it had risen every day for 24 years. The years after that kept turning. Asher Reuben Hawthorne was born in March of 1881. He was named for his grandfather, Reuben Sutcliffe, who had taught his daughter that to put her hand inside a laboring mare. He grew up to be a horseman. He took the running of the ranch from his father in 1908 and ran it until his own son took it from him in 1939. Marigold Beulah Hawthorne was born in 1884. She had her grandmother Beulah's firm, sweet mouth and her Aunt Cordelia's quick laugh. She taught school for 27 years at the Methodist Mission outside Cheyenne. She did not marry. She wrote to her mother every Sunday of her adult life in a careful copper plate that resembled more closely than anyone in the family ever remarked the hand of Captain Cyrus Hawthorne. Theron Cyrus Hawthorne was born in 1893. He was the late child, the unexpected one, the one Verity had thought she was past having when she felt the first turning of him inside her at the age of 36. He grew up small and watchful and quiet in the way of his Uncle Wendell. In 1917, he sailed for France with the American Expeditionary Force. He came back in the autumn of 1919 with a silver star and a long silence at the back of his eyes that his mother recognized at once. She did not press him. She set a place for him at the kitchen table and let him be silent. By the spring of 1920, he had begun to speak again, and by the summer of 1920, he had begun to laugh, and by the autumn of 1920, he had begun to ride out with his Uncle Wendell at the long working hours of the day, and the two of them spoke a private language of returning soldiers that the rest of the family, with great wisdom, did not try to learn. Wendell Hawthorne never married. He moved out of the loft to the barn in the summer of 1885 when Asher was 4 and Marigold was a year old, and he took the small cabin Rufus and old Jeb had built for him on the rise above the spring house, where he could look down on the home place and see every morning when he rose the smoke from his brother's kitchen chimney. He kept the harmonica he had carried at Little Bighorn. He played it every evening on the porch of the small cabin, and the children of the homestead grew up to the sound of it, the way other children grew up to the sound of a clock in a hall. He died in his sleep in a small cabin in the autumn of 1934 at the age of 84, with the harmonica on the bedside table beside him and Marcus Aurelius open on the quilt across his chest. Rufus Hawthorne died 2 years before his brother in the winter of 1932, in his own bed at the home place with his wife's hand in his own. He had lived long enough to see his first great-grandchild, a girl named Ruth, born the previous July. The last words he spoke were her name. Old Jeb Tannehill outlived all of his own generation. He died in a small cabin 3 miles north of Cold Hollow in the spring of 1903, and at the age of 84 of nothing in particular, except the long natural completion of a life. He left his cabin and his hawk and rifle and his bone-handled Bowie to Wendell, with a brief written note that said only, "See to the boy." Verity Sutcliffe Hawthorne lived to be 88 years old. She buried her husband in 1932 and her brother-in-law in 1934, and she lived alone in the cabin at Coal Hollow for the 11 years that followed, except that she was never alone because the cabin at Coal Hollow was rarely without a child or grandchild or great-grandchild at her kitchen table at any hour of any day. She kept teaching herself new things until the very end. She learned to drive an automobile in 1929 at the age of 72 and drove it badly but with great satisfaction for 9 more years. She learned to use a typewriter in 1933 at the age of 76, and from that point on, she answered her correspondence at 15 words a minute and was very pleased with herself. On a fence post at the gate of the home place, hand-carved in cedar, there is to this day a small wooden plaque. The plaque was put there by Wendell Hawthorne in the summer of 1881 when he was 31 years old and had finally come back from a war. The plaque is weathered now and the letters are gentled by 140 winters, but they can still be read by a person who knows how to look. This is the place the road found her. Below the plaque on the porch on most clear afternoon in the long century that followed, a series of women in turn sat in the same rocking chair, looking out at the same valley, and a series of grandchildren in turn climbed up to ask the same question about the same long-ago day in the snow, and a series of women in turn took the small hands into their own line ones and began the answer the same way. I came on a Concord stagecoach. It was the last stage of the season. The snow was already falling. I had 73 cents in my purse and a letter from a man I had never met. I was 22 years old. I was very afraid. And then on two horses out of the pines, two men came down the mountain.